Welcome to Story Time. Get ready, navigate for quick wisdom of countless stories. Let's dive into the world of knowledge together and explore. Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, in a quaint little village nestled at the edge of an enchanting forest, lived a sweet girl named Little Red Riding Hood. Now, why Little Red Riding Hood, you ask? Well, it wasn't because she had an affinity for hoods or even because she was little, though she was quite petite. It was actually because her grandmother, who loved her dearly, had sewn her a beautiful red cape with a matching hood. It was the talk of the town, and once she started wearing it, people couldn't help but call her Little Red Riding Hood. Even the name stuck so well that no one seemed to remember her real name anymore, not even Little Red herself. But she didn't mind, it was a good nickname after all. Little Red Riding Hood was a curious girl with a heart as big as her bright blue eyes. She loved wandering through the village, chatting with the animals, and exploring the woods. But despite her adventurous spirit, she was also a good, obedient girl who always listened to her mother. Most of the time, anyway. Her mother was a wise woman, though she had a habit of warning Little Red about the dangers of the forest, particularly about the big, bad wolf who was said to lurk among the trees. Little Red, with the confidence of a girl who had never met a wolf, would nod and promise to be careful. But in the back of her mind, she always thought, how bad can a wolf really be? One sunny morning, when the birds were singing their sweetest tunes and the air was crisp and fresh, Little Red's mother called her into the kitchen. "Red," she said, as she tied a checkered apron around her waist. "Your grandmother is feeling under the weather today. I've packed a basket of goodies for you to take to her. There's some fresh bread, a little jar of honey, and that herbal tea she loves so much. Go straight to her house, and remember what I've always told you. Stay on the path and don't talk to strangers." Little Red Riding Hood nodded earnestly, though she was already daydreaming about the flowers she might pick along the way or the little streams she could hop over. "I'll be careful, Mama," she promised, giving her mother a quick hug before grabbing the basket. The forest that separated the village from grandmother's house was a place of wonder. Trees stretched up toward the sky, their leaves creating a green canopy that dappled the ground with sunlight. Wildflowers of every color dotted the path, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of moss and the sweet perfume of blooming plants. As Little Red made her way along the path, she began to hum a little tune, swinging the basket in time with her steps. It wasn't long before she spotted a patch of bright yellow daffodils just off the path. They were too beautiful to resist. Grandmother would love these, she thought, and with that, she stepped off the trail to pick a few. Now, what Little Red didn't know was that she was being watched. You see, the forest wasn't entirely devoid of danger, despite its beauty. And true to her mother's warnings, the big, bad wolf had indeed noticed Little Red from his hiding spot behind a thick bush. The wolf was clever, cunning even, and he had a knack for finding his next meal. But unlike most wolves, who would simply pounce on their prey, this particular wolf liked to play with his food. He enjoyed the thrill of the chase and the satisfaction of outsmarting those around him. As Little Red busied herself with picking flowers, the wolf stepped out from behind the bush and padded silently toward her. "Good morning, little girl," he said, in the smoothest, most charming voice he could muster. Little Red, startled, looked up to see the wolf standing just a few feet away. But instead of being frightened, she was intrigued. She had never seen a wolf before, and this one, with his sleek fur and sharp eyes, seemed rather interesting. "Good morning, Mr. Wolf," she replied politely, because despite his rather toothy grin, he had been polite to her, and Little Red believed in good manners. "And where might you be going on this fine day?" the wolf asked, tilting his head in what he hoped was a friendly manner, though it only made him look more menacing. "I'm going to my grandmother's house," Little Red said, holding up the basket. "She's not feeling well, so I'm bringing her some things to make her feel better." The wolf's eyes gleamed at this information, but he kept his voice sweet. "Oh, how thoughtful of you. And does your grandmother live far from here?" "Not too far," Little Red answered, pointing down the path. "Just through the forest and by the big oak tree." The wolf's mind was racing with possibilities. He could follow her to the grandmother's house, but that might be too much trouble. No, a better plan was forming in his sly mind. Well, you're a very kind girl, but are you sure your grandmother wouldn't also like some fresh flowers? I know a spot just a little deeper in the forest where the most beautiful wildflowers grow. They're much prettier than these ones. Little Red's eyes widened at the thought of even more beautiful flowers. Oh, I'm sure she would love that, she exclaimed. Can you show me where they are? Of course, the wolf said, grinning wider. Just follow me. Little Red, completely unaware of the wolf's true intentions, followed him eagerly into the woods, leaving the path behind. They wandered deeper and deeper, the trees growing thicker and the shadows longer. After a while, the wolf pointed to a small clearing up ahead, where indeed, a patch of vibrant, colorful flowers was blooming. There you go, he said. Pick as many as you like. Little Red wasted no time in running to the flowers, her basket forgotten on the ground as she gathered the blossoms. The wolf watched her for a moment, then quietly slipped away, heading straight for grandmother's house. Now, grandmother was a sharp old lady, sharp in wit and in her hearing, which was surprising given her age. So when she heard a knock on her door that morning, she was already suspicious. No one usually visited her except Little Red, and she wasn't expecting her for a while yet. But when she called out, "Who is it?" and heard Little Red's sweet voice say, "It's me, grandmother, Little Red Riding Hood," she relaxed. What she didn't know was that it wasn't Little Red at all, but the wolf, who had cunningly imitated her voice. "Well, come in, dear," grandmother said, settling back into her bed. The wolf grinned to himself, pushing the door open with ease. Inside, the little cottage was cozy, filled with the scent of herbs drying from the rafters and the warmth of a crackling fire. The wolf wasted no time. He leapt across the room, and before grandmother could even let out a scream, he gobbled her up whole. Now, you might think this is the end of grandmother, but fear not. This wolf wasn't very good at chewing, so he swallowed her in one big gulp, and she ended up sitting uncomfortably in his belly, quite alive and very annoyed. After dealing with grandmother, the wolf decided to take her place, thinking himself rather clever. He rummaged through her wardrobe until he found a long nightgown and one of her frilly nightcaps, which he then put on. It was quite a sight, a big, bad wolf in a lacy nightgown, but he was too pleased with himself to care. He climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to his chin, waiting for Little Red. It wasn't long before Little Red Riding Hood, having finally picked enough flowers, realized how late it was getting. She quickly gathered her things and rushed back to the path, scolding herself for losing track of time. When she arrived at her grandmother's house, she noticed something was off. The door was slightly ajar, and the usually lively garden seemed eerily quiet. But Little Red was a brave girl, so she pushed the door open and stepped inside. "Grandmother?" she called, peering around the room. "In here, dear," came a voice from the bed, though it sounded a bit rougher than usual. Little Red frowned but shrugged it off, walking over to the bed. "Grandmother, I brought you some goodies and flowers," she said, placing the basket on the bedside table. But as she looked at her grandmother, she couldn't help but notice that something was different. "Grandmother," she said slowly, "what big ears you have. The better to hear you with, my dear," the wolf replied, trying his best to sound grandmotherly. "And grandmother, what big eyes you have. The better to see you with, my dear," the wolf said, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "And grandmother," Little Red continued, her brow furrowing, "what big teeth you have. The better to eat you with," the wolf roared, throwing off the covers and leaping at Little Red. But here's the thing. Little Red might have been a little naive, but she wasn't stupid. The moment she saw those big teeth, she knew something was wrong, and as the wolf lunged at her, she grabbed the basket and swung it as hard as she could at his snout. The wolf, taken by surprise, yelped and stumbled back. Little Red didn't waste any time. She turned and bolted out the door, screaming for help as she ran. Luckily for her, a woodcutter who was chopping wood nearby heard her cries and came rushing over with his axe. He reached the cottage just as the wolf was about to give chase. "Stay back, you beast!" the woodcutter shouted, brandishing his axe. The wolf, who had thought himself invincible just moments before, suddenly realized that maybe, just maybe, he had bitten off more than he could chew, literally. With a growl of frustration, he turned and fled into the woods, leaving a trail of torn lace from the nightgown behind him. The woodcutter, satisfied that the wolf was gone, turned to Little Red, who was catching her breath by the doorway. "Are you all right, little one?" he asked, concerned. "Yes, I'm okay," Little Red panted. "But my grandmother. He ate my grandmother." The woodcutter's eyes widened. "Not on my watch," he said, and without a moment's hesitation, he grabbed his axe and marched into the cottage. Sure enough, there was the wolf's bulging belly, and with a quick, decisive swing of his axe, he split it open. Out popped grandmother, a little worse for wear but otherwise unharmed. She took one look at the scene, at the woodcutter, at the now very dead wolf, and then at her beloved Little Red, who was teary-eyed and clutching the basket. "Thank goodness you're safe," grandmother exclaimed, pulling Little Red into a hug. "Thank goodness you're safe," Little Red echoed, hugging her back. And so, after thanking the brave woodcutter and making sure the wolf was well and truly gone, Little Red and her grandmother sat down to enjoy the goodies in the basket. The whole ordeal had made them quite hungry, after all. As they sipped tea and nibbled on bread, grandmother gave Little Red a stern but loving look. "Now, what have we learned today?" she asked. Little Red sighed, knowing what was coming. "To stay on the path and not talk to strangers," she recited. "Exactly," grandmother said, smiling. "But also that you're a brave girl with a good heart. Just remember to be careful. All right?" Little Red nodded, feeling a bit wiser for her adventure. "I will, grandmother. I promise." And so, with the wolf gone and the lesson learned, Little Red Riding Hood returned home later that day with quite the story to tell her mother. From then on, she always stayed on the path, though she still couldn't resist picking a few flowers along the way. After all, a little adventure is good for the soul, just as long as you know when to run and when to swing a basket at a wolf's nose. And as for the wolf, well, let's just say the forest was a much safer place after that. Though some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the rustling of lace as he roams the woods, grumbling about little girls with red hoods and their surprisingly strong right hooks. And they all lived happily ever after, except the wolf, of course. Thanks for tuning in. For more enlightening content and a detailed summary, visit www.mybooksummary.com. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. Let's inspire and empower each other. Subscribe to our channel and share our videos with your friends and family.